Qualitative research is a valid and highly valuable way to study complex events. However, writing a qualitative study can be deceptively difficult. If a clear roadmap is not followed, the study can quickly deteriorate into a wandering anecdote and sound more like a blog post or newspaper article than an academic article. My name is Jeffrey Frank. I'm a statistician and the CEO of Stat59. In this video, I will show you how to choose from 5 straightforward, established methodologies and show you how to implement them quickly to develop a solid, high-impact qualitative study. The objectives of this presentation are to understand and to have a working definition of a qualitative study and to recognize the 5 qualitative study designs and when to use them. What is qualitative research? Well, qualitative research is an inquiry process of understanding that's based on several distinct factors. One is a distinct methodological tradition of inquiry. Another is an exploration of a social or human problem. In these studies, the researcher is building a complex, holistic model, and the analysis of words and views of informants is important. And these studies take place in a natural setting. Although we're going to discuss 5 different methodologies for qualitative studies, they all share some common characteristics. One is the natural setting. In these studies, the researcher is a key instrument rather than being a passive observer. They use multiple types of methods, and they involve complex reasoning and inductive logic. The participants may have multiple perspectives, they're context dependent, and often follow an emergent design where the methodology is developed during the process. They're reflexive, and they take into account a holistic account. How do we do a good qualitative study? Well, very important is to begin with a single focus or concept, to use rigorous data collection and analysis and a structured reporting. All the time, we should make sure that we're using an ethical approach. And the best way to do this, to do a good qualitative study, is to use a recognized study design. Qualitative studies are not blog posts or newspaper articles. They're research articles. They're academic research articles, and they should follow an established design. In this presentation, we're going to talk about 5 established designs, which are the narrative, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, and case study. For reference, this book on qualitative inquiry and research design by Creswell is an excellent approach for qualitative research. During this presentation, we're going to talk about the Configno Amatrice earthquake. This earthquake took place on the 4th of August 2016 with an epicenter at Akumuli, a magnitude of 6.2. There was at least 2,500 aftershocks, and this earthquake was devastating for the region, with 300 people killed. This is a look at Configno prior to the earthquake, and this is after. What happened during the Configno Amatrice earthquake? Following the earthquake, there was a massive amount of aid. There was government aid in the form of temporary housing for businesses, schools, and even animals, and an offer to repay reconstruction costs. Banks gave businesses money for reconstruction, and there was a massive outpouring of private donations, both nationally and internationally, of clothing, food, electronics, food and shelter for animals, and money which went directly to the community administration. Personal communication with members of the community administration found that they had too many donations. They had large warehouses that were at capacity, and they said, quote, they have everything they need and more. And in fact, the community was incapable of receiving further donations. However, communication with family members revealed that family members were living in very marginal temporary shelters. They lacked some of the basic support necessities. There was a strong feeling that the aid was very unevenly distributed, and people did not have access even to appropriate medications. So, how can we discover more about this disconnect between how the administration viewed the donation situation and the way the locals did? Well, this is an excellent way to use qualitative research. When do we use qualitative research? Well, there are a number of reasons we might want to. One is a lack of fit between quantitative measures and the problem. So here we see that quantitatively, there seem to be adequate donations, and yet there seemed to be this lack of fit. Sometimes we need a complex and detailed understanding. We have a desire to empower individuals. Often this literary, flexible style is needed. We need to understand the context of the problem when we're looking for an explanation of a mechanism or when we're trying to develop a theory. So how could each of these 5 types of qualitative methodologies be used? And in this presentation, we're going to go through the narrative, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, and case study, and show how they might be used to study the Amatrice earthquake. First, we're going to talk about narrative studies. So narrative studies tell the story of an individual's experience. They focus on a specific time and place, and usually we get this data from interviews, although we sometimes get them from direct observations, documents, pictures, or even now electronic media. These are best for capturing a detailed experience of a single individual or a small number of individuals. So how could we use the narrative study to study the Configno Amatrice earthquake? Well, first we would develop a purpose statement, and we're going to do that shortly. Then we determine if the research problem actually best fits narrative research. We're going to select one or more individuals and spend a lot of time with them, gathering the story. We're going to embed information about the context into the data, reorganize the stories into a framework by a process called restoring, and then embed this in a collaborative approach. The purpose statement is the most important part of qualitative research. This is very similar to the null and alternative hypothesis used in quantitative research, and it answers the question, what am I trying to prove? As Creswell notes in his book, unfortunately, all too many writers leave this statement implicit, causing the readers extra work in interpreting and following the study. This is exactly what we do not want to do. We would like to make sure that our readers, very early on when reading our manuscript, understand what we're trying to prove, at which point it's very easy for them to follow along in our manuscript. The purpose statement? Well, in the book by Creswell, there's a very, very nice formula for how to write this, which involves the purpose of you describe the study, is to using this phenomena for these participants at the research site. And I'm going to demonstrate how to use this purpose statement formula for each of the 5 designs. For instance, for our narrative design, we might write, the purpose of this narrative study was to describe the barriers to delivery of aid faced by a single family during the 2016 Amatrice earthquake. So how would we actually do this narrative study? Well, we would pick a family, we'd spend some time with them, ask them, what was your life like before the earthquake? What happened during the earthquake? And what happened after? And get their story of how they experienced the situation with getting adequate aid. The second type of study we'll talk about is phenomenological research. In this case, we focus about a phenomena or an event, and we describe the common experiences of many individuals who experience the event. This usually focuses on 3 to 25 individuals, and usually involves interviewing the individuals and documenting their responses. So here, we're really looking for answers to 2 major questions. What have you experienced? And what is the context or situation that have affected your experiences? So how will we do this in the case of the Amatrice earthquake? Well, first, again, we will develop our purpose statement, check to make sure we're comfortable that we're using the right methodology. We identify the phenomenon, what is it that we're studying, and describe it. And then we interview multiple individuals, here maybe from 5 to 250. And from those interviews, we're going to generate themes of significant statements. And we're going to report the essence of the phenomena. Our purpose statements might look like this. The purpose of this phenomenological study was to describe the experience of obtaining aid for victims of the 2016 Amatrice earthquake. So here we are. We will describe among the community, we'll interview people, we'll talk to them, what was it like to experience this earthquake? Obviously, things will be different from family to family, individual to individual, but we're going to then tease out the themes that show commonality among the experiences of this phenomenon. The next type of qualitative research is a fascinating methodology called grounded theory. In grounded theory, we move beyond observations and we actually generate or discover a theory, where this theory is grounded in the data from the participants. This is a fascinating methodology because the data collection, analysis, and the development of the theory occur simultaneously. So unlike quantitative studies, where null hypothesis must be formed prior to data collection, and we specify that at the outset, here we go in as an investigator looking to develop a theory. Remember here, qualitative research, the resultant theory may be suggestive, but is always incomplete and inconclusive. It's a low-level theory, but that should not stop us from moving ahead with our research, as these theories often serve as a springboard for more detailed and often quantitative analysis. So how could we do a grounded theory in this case? Again, we're going to develop our purpose statement. We'll check the indications. We'll obtain information from multiple data sources looking for convergent data. We'll focus on the interview questions on how the individuals experience the event, and we're going to build a theory. Often this involves memoing, writing lots of memos and then coding them, and then developing what we call a substantive level theory, a theory that is grounded in the data. Our purpose statement might look like this. The purpose of this grounded theory study was to discover the origin of the barriers to delivery of aid faced by victims of the 2016 Amatrice earthquake. In this case, we are going to develop a large amount of data, and it's very important to look for convergent data. Do the data all point to a similar theory? Data here might be involve interviews, either individually, focus group, and often questionnaires. It can involve observations, documents, and artifacts. And increasingly, we see websites, tweets, Facebook messages. So here, in the grounded theory study of the Amatrice Configno earthquake, we may be looking at the culture, the behavior of the people, and understanding why we had this disconnect between the aid seen by the community administration and seen by the individual family. Ethnographic research is our fourth research type. Ethnographic research focuses on the experience of a culture-sharing group and an attempt to develop a complex and complete description of the culture of the groups. We would look for patterns, behaviors, and rituals, and this is often written in a literary or storytelling approach. So how could we do an ethnographic study to study the Amatrice earthquake? Again, we make sure we're using the correct methodology. We identify a local culture sharing group to study. We select cultural themes, issues, and theories, and we gather information in the context of where the group lives, and then we compile a description of the culture sharing group. Purpose statement may look something like this. The purpose of this ethnographic study was to describe the unique characteristics of the agricultural communities in the Amatrice Configno area. Remembering in qualitative study that we are active observers, so we gather information of context where the group lives or works, and the role of the observer is very important in qualitative studies. We have to be very sensitive to the needs of the individuals, and we must report our own impact on the study group. In qualitative studies, in contrast to quantitative studies, researchers should position themselves in the study and make this information explicit in the report. So we should relay our past experiences through work or school, etc., and discuss how these experiences shape the study. For instance, if I were doing this study of the Amatrice earthquake, I would want to let people know about my previous experience as a disaster medicine physician and also my personal ties to the area. My wife's family is from the area. My mother-in-law and father-in-law were actually present during the earthquake and how that ties me to the community. So in this case, in ethnographic research, it would be very interesting to study the culture of the Configno area. I think we would find a very strongly independent agricultural community. And we also would probably note that this is a community that relies on themselves for help. This community is often reluctant to go outside of their friends and neighbors, who are their first resource for assistance. And our final type of qualitative research we will talk about is number 5, case studies. So case studies are when we use examples to illustrate an issue. And multiple cases are common. We usually begin with a description analysis of each case, which is our within case analysis, and follow them with a thematic analysis of all the cases. Usually we'll use a maximum of 4 to 5 cases in a qualitative study, as the amount of data we collect can be quite cumbersome. So how could we study the Configno earthquake using a case study? Again, we're going to check to make sure we're using the correct study design. We're going to identify the intent of the study and select the cases, and then develop procedures to obtain this extensive data from multiple sources. And then we're going to use to specify our analysis report approach, which may be themes or context in cross-case studies. Our purpose statement may look like this. The purpose of this case series was to compare and contrast the delivery of aid to victims of the 2009 earthquake in L'Aquila, the 2012 earthquake in Emilia-Romagna, and the 2016 earthquake in Amatrice. Now, analysis of qualitative data can be very cumbersome because the amount of data can quickly become overwhelming. What we often see is that ideas are worded differently by participants, and they need to be grouped somehow. What we like to do is we try not to change the wording if possible, but what we do like to do is identify statements that are similar and group them together. We retain the unique statements, and the grouped statements are then developed into themes. How you do that can be very difficult. One of the things we like to do is the Affinity Diagram, where each of the data points is written on a separate piece of paper, and they are taped onto larger pieces of paper under themes. Fishbone diagrams are another way to organize our data. And text mining can be useful. In this case, we're doing some text mining of the Twitter feed following an earthquake. Data analysis for qualitative studies requires a strong commitment. It takes a large amount of time, a large amount of resources, and it is not an easy substitute for a quantitative study. Qualitative studies contain all the rigor of quantitative studies and the same burden of adequate data analysis. So here, in the case studies, first we would gather data from each of the 3 earthquakes, describe each of the 3 earthquakes, and then we would look for things that tie them together. How were things similar between the earthquakes, and how were things different? For instance, we might find that the response and the attitude towards aid may have been very different in L'Aquila, where the earthquake epicenter was in a city, compared to Configno, where the epicenter was in a small agricultural community. How do we choose? We've talked about narrative, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, and case studies. How do we choose which of these designs to use? There's a number of ways to look at this. One is your background as a researcher. One is looking at what is most needed in the scholarly literature. What are you most comfortable with? And who is the audience? Who is going to read your paper? What we like to do is we try to make our qualitative studies engaging to the audience. We want people to read our study and to be engaged with it. So how do you do that? Well, one is studying a unique sample. Sometimes we just assume an unconventional perspective, or we observe an uncommon site or collect atypical forms of data, presenting the findings in an unusual way, and focusing on a timely topic. All of these are ways that we would like to engage our audience. Finally, a few words about mixed methodology. In mixed methodology, a study consists of two parts, a qualitative and a quantitative piece. Generally, we can mix any type of qualitative study with any type of quantitative study, and the methodology for each part follows the standard practice for that. This usually results in three possible mixed methodology designs. One is the convergent design. Sometimes we would analyze the qualitative and quantitative data at the same time. Perhaps in this case, we would look at doing a survey and interviews at the same time during the collection of the data for the earthquake. Sometimes we use an explanatory sequential series. Here we're starting with quantitative data and then move on to qualitative data. Perhaps in this case, we would start by looking at some numbers as far as the amount of aid that came in and the amount that went out. Often what happens is we then look and we find something unusual in the quantitative analysis, and then we move on to ask why. And that's where the qualitative study comes in. And then there's exploratory sequential. Here we start with the qualitative data and move on to the quantitative data. For instance, in this case, we may have looked first at the qualitative study and then moved on to see the actual numbers. Perhaps we would look actually what amount of aid came in to each of the three earthquakes and what went out. So in this video, we saw that we can easily apply each of these 5 qualitative methodologies to a complex event, the Amatrice earthquake. We also saw that defining the methodology at the outset of the study and setting the purpose statement first paves the way to a smooth road ending in a high-impact study. So in the future, instead of wandering around your qualitative data in the dark and hoping to stumble upon a hit novel, why not follow a dedicated methodology from the start and quickly develop a valid, high-impact qualitative manuscript? I'm Jeffrey Franck. I'm a statistician and the CEO of Stat59. If you would like to learn how the Stat59 web app can skyrocket the design, analysis, and preparation of your next qualitative manuscript, please check out the Stat59 website at www.stat59.com.